I'm Isaac with 120 Water.
And I'm Chelsea with Rogue Water, and we're excited to welcome you to the Make Water Work and Catalyst Collab.
Well, hi everyone. I'm Isaac from 120 Water, and welcome to the Make Water Work Catalyst Collab. This is a podcast series leading up to the Catalyst, not conference. It's an experience. They don't have speakers, they have guides. But we have the privilege of interviewing one of those guides who will be really walking through what it means to have impactful communication. And I'm excited to have this conversation. It's with George Schuler, who is the co-founder of Connecting for Change. He's a systems strategist and network analyst who has spent nearly 3 decades working at the intersection of water, conservation, philanthropy, and global institutions. So welcome, George, to the podcast.
Thanks. Great to be here.
Yeah, when I was talking to Chelsea about having this podcast series, she brought up your name right away. She's like, I'm really excited to introduce you to George. And what he's going to be bringing to this year's Catalyst. And so I'm excited to have this conversation. I love starting every conversation that we have on this podcast with the question, how did water find you? So George, how did water find you?
You know, it's kind of funny because the water community is the only one that has that that very family-oriented question about, like, how did this come into your life? And I tell that to other groups that are not from the water sector, and they all look at me like I'm a little bit off. But I think that for me, it was water that found me. I didn't necessarily find water. I was an environmental science major coming out of graduate school, and I knew the things that I wanted to work on. I wanted to be close to nature. I wanted to be in the context of working with people and communities, having grown up in rural Ohio on a farm. And my first job was working in a river basin in a small, really rural type area with the river just feet away from my office. And I had all the tools. I had studied water and rivers in college and in grad school. It was a hidden thing that was easy for me to understand, and I had a lot of experience with it. And so all of a sudden, I found myself being a water person, and it wasn't like a life's ambition.
Yep.
But it found me and then said, hey, this is a good space for you. And the people, I think that the subtext also was the people, both professional and the way that citizens oriented themselves to water in general in the places that I worked, really kind of cemented that relationship for me. It said, okay, you're one of us. This is your tribe.
Yeah. That's phenomenal. And take us a little bit from, tell us a little bit about your early work leading up to creating Connecting for Change.
So I was with the Nature Conservancy for 28 years, and I had a really interesting career. And I was hired as the program director for a watershed initiative, one of the early ones in the Nature Conservancy where it was beginning to shift from rare species and nature preserves to kind of landscapes, watersheds. And I was one of the early water hires. In fact, it was probably the first wave of water hires in the Conservancy. And it meant that I had to do everything from community organizing to developing monitoring plans and leading science crews to writing grants to managing the preserve just because my office was there. And so it was this microcosm of all the skills you'd need in conservation, including being a freshwater biologist. And that grew from doing some land acquisitions and doing some really basic water quality monitoring to running a really large basin monitoring program with a federal partner, to the Conservancy's first dam removal, and actually the first dam removal in New York State for environmental reasons, large policy changes around water supply in in New York City and in the Delaware River Basin. And it was this progression of I would always I would build kind of an understanding of the problem I had to solve. I would work on it. I would find connections to other teams and other places, either that could help me, like my USGS partners could help me do something, or it might have been somebody in another country, in another state that was doing something, and my brain could piece together, hey, I can learn something from this, and this will help.
Yeah.
And so I started to build both this relational network, but also that let me travel to other countries and coach other teams or be part of other planning teams for water resource projects in the Caribbean or in China. And so my experience around water and kind of applying how I understood water grew not only in the water perspective, but also in just in conservation, trying other models for things. And I think the through thread was in the early days, I wanted to be seen as a scientist and have more data and better models so that people could see the truth.
Yeah.
And if they saw the truth, they would do better. They would make better decisions. And then I realized that's ridiculous. That doesn't happen that way. And there was a real profound moment where we had been working on environmental flows. We were trying to build tools so that New York State could make water management decisions better. And we were grounding it in the best science available that we could put together.
Yeah.
And there came a moment where I think it was the state of Michigan created a new permitting framework around water. And what we all realized, my little team, was it was grounded in science, but really it was bounded by the decisions of what did people want their rivers and lakes and streams to look like in the future. That was kind of the big thing. And that was the shift, I think, for me in some real foundational ways from data is the truth to people are kind of the firmament that sits in, and getting people to move in the right direction and be connected in the right ways to make active decisions about what they want the future to be like was a shift. And so the last decade or so at the Nature Conservancy really was about, in a very active sense, because we had an initiative around this, establishing new types of partners and building new sorts of tools and approaches for there to be stakeholder engagement or for people to work together. And so that meant things like we built a collective leadership training program that was kind of open source. You could use it for any social or environmental issue, but the trick was that for the water version, we had people bring their knowledge of water. What we conveyed to them was, how do you work together? What does leadership look like in kind of a distributed leadership avenue? We built board games. We said, there's enough consultants and people who come into meetings using stickies to try to get people on the same page. What if we played games? And so we built an actual board game and used it both for training in collaboration, but also to begin those difficult conversations in communities. And then we also, we had built some tools that were for the state and for stakeholders who are applying for permits around water. And we found that ordinary lay people in communities were really clamoring for them. And we weren't, but they had things like flow duration curves. They had like hydrologist, schematics and graphics and terminology in them. And we realized that there's a mismatch here about who wants to use this, or where's the biggest demand, and then what language does it use to convey information about water. And solving that problem took us down this avenue of we partnered with Unity Technologies, like one of the big game engines. So there's kids play Fortnite. So Epic has their Unreal Engine, which is one of the big game engines. Unity is the other end of the barbell. And so we just reached out to them and said, we'd like to try this thing. And we want to make it like a Clash of Clans or something that's very intuitive to see the landscape. And so we built this thing where you could, instead of worrying about data and metrics and milligrams per liter, it was really about seeing it very intuitively and understanding, oh, there's a problem. This is where the problem is coming from. And these are the people I need to connect with to begin ideating around a solution, or at least some shared understanding. And so when I left the Conservancy, we had grown into all these experiences that were more people-based, and the fundamental underlying thing that was, wow, it takes a lot of time to kind of organically find the right partners for things, the right collaborators, the right this, or the right mentors, and there's got to be a better way.
Yeah.
And we had stumbled in a project that we did that was a governance analysis of how water decisions were made in New York. We had stumbled into this tool called network analysis through a collaborator at the University of Buffalo. And we suddenly started to see that there was a way to systematically and more robustly map where are the connections between people and institutions, and the different roles that people and institutions in a map play, so that it's not just the person who's near you or that organization that looks like yours that is the best one to reach out to. They're not all created equal, and some are gatekeepers, and some are real connectors, and some can help you reach something that you don't quite know yet. And that methodology really connected with our ethos about how do we collaborate better.
Yeah.
And that began life as Connecting for Change, and trying to bring that to the water sector, because that's not how we work. And it's almost social science. So it's out of the kind of the technical realm of most water practitioners, regardless of kind of where you enter. And that made us a little bit unique, and has been a really fascinating journey to be the voice of that approach, or that ethos in the water conversations.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I'm definitely dating myself when you're talking about building games and simulations. You know, like when you think about, like, for me, it was playing SimCity or Roller Coaster Tycoon. Those kind of games where you're trying to build spaces, but I think it can be easy to let our engineering run away with creating solutions or creating things before knowing all of the variables and conversations and impacts of everything, which is delicate. Like, we don't, I think our human nature is to, like, I don't necessarily want to invite too many people into the conversation, but when you're dealing with shared spaces, which is, you know, our land, our the places that we're gonna develop things, build cities, do whatever, we have to have people that know how to say, hey, here, we need to consider this. Here's the impact of here's what this river produces for this community. Making changes impacts that, and then there's no way to get around it in the water space. You know, sometimes people say, like, they love water because it's not political. On some level, I'm like, I think it's actually more than political. It actually drives us to say, well, what do we value, and how are we going to organize ourselves around this resource and understand the impact that it has on our lives? Yeah,
there were kind of two moments that connect to that were, I think of when we were at when my team was at the Nature Conservancy, and one was we were working with a municipality upstate. We were going to do kind of a plan for how they can manage their watershed, some of which their water supply watershed, some of which didn't sit in the municipality's boundaries. It was in a neighboring one. And I remember we would go to the village council meetings and their environmental board meetings, and at one of the village council meetings, several representatives stood up and said, is there a way to do this without talking to the neighboring town? And I said, no, that's the whole point here. They have a chunk of your watershed under their zoning regs and whatever. And so that hey, we do need to talk to other people. And more than that, there needs to be a real vulnerability of that relationship, the real collaboration. And then the other part was that, and I think this is kind of in my DNA and in my co-founder Sarah's DNA, which is we arrived at that board game because we saw a simulation model done by a Dutch researcher at Deltares, their hydrology institute, and we're like, this is really cool. This would be transformative for our partners. And then we sat back and said, but we can't do this. We don't have enough resources or the data to create some powerful models, predictive models that then you could skin over with some game. And one of us had the idea of, well, what if we just made the game part? And we focused on those social elements of, hey, how do you start to get people to think about working with their neighbor in collaboration, or working with another role in the watershed in collaboration to solve a shared problem. So that was a really critical kind of touch point for us to say, there's a through thread here about collaboration and looking beyond your boundaries.
Yeah. I like what you said about that, forcing some level of vulnerability. And while that's not something that we want to do, creating the safe space of letting people work through that, I think is almost an exercise in saying, helping us understand, well, what are the right questions we should be asking? I think a lot of times we enter into things just saying, I have my position, I'm for or against, versus saying, we have to have a conversation and understanding of how we're going to use something that is literally fluid. And so we don't own every part of it. And so we have to lean into the actual human experience that we're actually designed to have more than anything else.
The other thing that I think in the last few years that I've learned is that there's a complicating skin to that, which is the institutions that we work for or that are part of that landscape. While many of the individuals in them and even their missions can philosophically recognize the need for collaboration or for coordinated action or collective action, their incentives for that kind of prevent that in some ways. And so nonprofits are often kind of looked at as, this is the linchpin to kind of putting utilities and funders and corporations together, except that nonprofits are kind of also driven by resource scarcity. To ensure resources, they've got to kind of make sure their brand is out there. There's an ownership to their ideas or coming up with a new idea or to a project that almost precludes them from being vulnerable enough to say, okay, the only way to solve this is if we all kind of give up a little and work, give some permission to each other to set goals and to kind of chime in and be collaborative here. And we see that in a lot of different ways, all the way from kind of inadvertent, we have our portfolio, we kind of draw our line, we only work here, we kind of work with certain organizations, from that kind of mild, almost accidental inability to kind of really deeply collaborate, all the way to the fearfulness of, if we don't show up at this meeting and say our stuff, our branding, or our view of the world, then the other people at the meeting, someone else at the meeting, another institution will put its message out there and they will own the issue, and we won't be able to continue.
Yeah, we need to be on offense, we don't want to be on defense the whole time.
And so there's this, we're not really strengthened or incentivized to do it all the way to the shadow side of collaboration, which is almost being subverted. And I don't think any of it is totally conscious. And I think it's not totally conscious because we often don't look at the network effects of, oh, it's not just us showing up and trying to deal with them. It really is, we're all connected here trying to solve a larger problem. And I don't quite see that landscape clearly to understand, oh, I'm one of many, and I'm truly one of many.
Yeah.
So there's that complicating skin over the institutions that we kind of rely on, that complicates how we collaborate as a movement around water, climate. We see this in philanthropy. We did a recent analysis of the Great Lakes Funders Network and looking at all of their giving, not just water, but everything. And what was really interesting was, despite the fact that there's a lot of resources going into a geographic region to solve a lot of social and environmental problems, the portfolios for each are fairly discrete. There is a fairly small percentage of nonprofits that are getting funding from multiple sources, which one suggestion from that is we're not built to be able to focus on either really high performing nonprofits or really critical projects or issues where we can or are making a difference. We're really kind of in our own little silos. And that is something that in a lot of different lights we have seen play out every time we've kind of done some sort of larger analysis around funding or collaboration, that things they separate and silo out pretty clearly.
Yeah, that reminds me a lot, of it's the pendulum swing that we even see in government funding with SRF. There's always this state revolving loan funds. There are these things, but then there's this always tense tension and conversation around earmarks and what happens when things get specified here and people can't decide how it's best used for the greater good of their state, but the notion of earmarks helps elected officials put their name on something to keep the program going in the first place. So there's just kind of this stuck in the middle aspect. And you were saying before we hit record, you were talking about how this conversation was coming off of the heels of an event that you were just at that kind of illustrated the network effect. Would love for you to talk more about that.
Yeah, so it was the Alliance for Water Stewardship's Global Water Stewardship Summit. And throughout all the conversations, whether they were about innovative funding or the Alliance's membership structure or corporate water stewardship projects around the world, there was a lot of talk about collective action was the way to kind of essentially scale up impact. And explicitly, this was the first year that I can remember this ever being said, that explicitly it relied upon trust and relationships. Every kind of dissection or description of a project or a convening or a gathering or something that was multi-stakeholder kind of at some point said something about trust and relationships. But then there was this jump from, this is really what matters, to, hey, we need more funding, or we need to, have a platform that people can interact with, or we just need to get more people in the room or make sure there's more diversity. And it kind of skipped over. We spend a lot of time on infrastructure, whether it's real water infrastructure or kind of the institutional infrastructure of money, power, coordination, et cetera. And we spend very little time even talking about the relational infrastructure. And I think it is in part because that's a soft skill that is perceived as a soft skill. I mean, most engineers and communicators and biologists and managers don't know kind of the social science part of that, where you can measure those things. You can come up with ways to build trust and familiarity and build those relational ties. It's just it's beyond our purview, or it's in the midst of the edges of the water community.
Yeah.
And we're not alone in that, but it's one of those things where it was always mentioned, but the solutions never revolved around it. And we could just, if we just reached out, we could grab some expertise and bring it into the fold, which is, I think, become Connecting for Change's role in these
Yeah.
conversations.
Yeah. Yeah. That reminds me, like, one of my one quote that kind of lives rent free in my head. I believe it was FDR said, people don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. And that is just, that plays out over and over, that it's like they only know how much you care once you start communicating and they feel trusted with information or trusted with transparency. And I recognize that that's a double-edged sword of like, how much unstructured information do you want to give people that is actually more confusing and doesn't allow them to react to anything substantial. So like, there's an art in creating the container for the conversation, and recognizing that we're stewards of different kinds of containers, and we're figuring out where do these overlay.
And I think this is a little bit of a diversion from that, but I think there is a relationship that we see that a lot. So early in my career as a biologist or hydrologist, I did monitoring projects. We had data. We tried to use that data and have that data inform local decisions or organizational decisions. And it took a long time to realize that the data that was meaningful to me wasn't necessarily meaningful to others. And I think there is this simultaneously, there is in the environmental movement broadly, there is always this clamor for more data. And I think there is a slight disconnect between the more data or any data communicating what really people need to know, not what the data says is you need to know this. It's, hey, this would help me. And in fact, we had a discussion with an institution recently, and they were building out a dashboard to make water management decisions. And I kind of called out and I said, so you're dealing with citizens who are part of the decision-making process in the state you're at. Do they know what, these units mean, and how will they know when it's too little or too much, or whether they're right on, because that you're not articulating that in the dashboard or the tool. And I think that there is this giving people the pieces of information in the way, or the tools in the way that they need to be able to do something productive with it, constructive with it. And there is more to that than I think. There's more art or science to that than I think that we give it credit for. And I think we see that in our relational work too, that we, my co-founder and I have worked really hard we don't give giant spidery network maps to people because it looks cool, and nearly every network scientist, network analyst gives you that, but you're like, well, there are a few things I can take away from the best of them, but most of them, they're just too overwhelming. What I really need to know is, who do I go to? Who do I talk to? Where is that path that I can thread that gets me my end objective? A new funder, a new collaborator, a new something, or strengthens something. And oftentimes that's not the raw data set looking at you, or something an academic would want. There's a place for that, but it's trying to kind of mesh what do the people that really are on the ground or on the edge need to know, and what is it that I have that I can kind of transform into that.
Yeah. I know, and those kind of themes pull me so much into the world of like, some of the psychologists and folks who lean into that for the way they talk about communication, but I think about like Brene Brown talking, her phrase of clear is kind, and how do you give clarity to what you're actually trying to communicate? It's not giving tons of information as much as it is giving insight about what are we talking about? Like it's and that a lot of times we can mistake giving a lot of things as communicating when it's actually creating more confusion, because it's taking me a lot of time to process it, and then my brain checks out, and then I'm just going to latch onto whatever things seemed interesting, and I think we see that a lot with like how information becomes misinformation or disinformation or something else. Is like there was so much, enough of it felt true, and it ran away, and now we're combating versus saying, hey, we're gonna agree within this container, which is epically hard to do.
And there is kind of, I think in the water community there is a challenge that compounds that just the raw idea of message or utility of information packet. And it's that my co-founder Sarah lives in Maine. I'm in New York, and she has a role that locally she works with the Soil and Water District and others on local water issues. And there was one particular day she wrote me, she was working with a farmer standing on the edge of a drainage ditch, looking at where it was dumping into a creek, and there was a bridge that was of concern because it had been flooded out a couple times. And so it was tied to, could the ambulance, as a really rural area, could the ambulance and fire trucks get over it reliably? Kind of a very nuts and bolts on the ground type thing. And I was sitting on a virtual meeting with global institutions talking about global water, sustainability goals. And she said, where is the connection between the two of those? It's like crazy that you and I are in the same field and we're disconnected by that much. And it began this idea of, there are examples in the world where the knowledge and experience of utilities and conservation groups who are doing projects on the ground feeds back to that center, that where they're setting large goals or frameworks or understanding what is happening on the ground and changing policy in some cases. But the water sector doesn't really have that. And I would argue that that it's not unique to us, but that example where what we say the center is connected to the edges, and there's the ability to learn, and the ability is not just we're going to shove stuff, our great ideas from Washington or New York down into, Cincinnati, Ohio. It's that we recognize what the learnings are from the Cincinnati water utility back at the center, and hey, that influences the goals or the framework or the tools or whatever it is that our center role is, so that when we send it out next time, they see themselves in it. And there's that feedback loop, and we see that there are issues. There are examples from politics. There are examples from co-management of fisheries, and even tribal management of bison herds out west, where they've kind of perfected this. It goes out, but there's also a signal that comes back, and so it's vibrant, and everybody feels connected to a movement or at least a purpose. And it's part of that keeping the fidelity of information, but it is also having the pathways to connect that learning and then the data and experience route back to the center to be digested and put into the whole, which is really missing, because we don't. And I think what it gets labeled as many times at the global level is, well, we don't have something as simple as, carbon concentrations in the atmosphere. We need something really simple. And I think it's more than simple. I think it's how we invest in making sure that that restoration project in Florida and the water utility in Philadelphia, those messages and lessons learned and investments and experiences feed back into, this is what it means to do this thing well, or this is how we can change our incentive structure so there's more funding or better capacity building or whatever it may be. And
Yeah.
we lose that sometimes.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, we do. And it's one of those things that is just, as from my perspective, in coming from 120 Water, where we work with communities and state agencies, more specific on regulation for utilities, most popularly with lead legislation. There's a lot of transparency, and the EPA is demanding a lot more data be reported up and communicated out. And that transparency loop is, it both, I think we're still in the middle of grappling with, like, hey, that helps each state kind of put some benchmarks. It has to be published. We're trying to get to zero lead. How are we doing?
Yeah.
How much is left? What are we doing over this 10-year time frame? So it does time box it a little bit, and it at least gives some standardization to it. But there's always that role of how much do you standardize versus how much do you allow to be localized, because each place has different things that are important or constraints to them.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
the thing that kind of reminds me of is, so we, a couple of years ago, Sarah Waitley and I and some others who used to be at the Nature Conservancy published a paper on data use by utilities and others in New York State. And it was for water management. And it was what was really fascinating was the data that they were investing in collecting was stuff that was compliance based. It was in the regulations, you need to do this. It was not the data that many of them said, hey, if you really wanted us to manage things long term, or in the context of climate change, or for these other things, we would actually choose ourselves. And I thought that was a really interesting finding from that. And then also knowing how and New York may not be a unique case in many ways, but I think in a regulatory or governance situation, it kind of is. Big, seemingly wealthy state, but our agencies, they're juggling a lot. They're under-resourced. And so their ability to kind of say, wait a second, we can send a better signal out to the data generators and the actual managers of resources, both in the water utility realm, but also in the environmental realm. And we can do a better job of having this back and forth with them. And there are also state agencies that are not able to. New York doesn't have a water resource management plan at the state level. It doesn't have enough bandwidth to do that, and hasn't since the late 80s. And so there's some real fundamental structural challenges that we're not investing in as a society that could help prepare us for the future. And then I also lay on top of this, I got a call, it's been a while ago because I was still at the Conservancy, but for a decade or 15 years, I was deeply involved with the Delaware River Basin Commission and the state agencies that were a party to that. And I think my teams moved on. The Conservancy's priorities shifted. We had done what we said we were going to do, and some of the agency folks had gone on to retire and been promoted in all the states. And one day I got a call from someone who had been a peer and a partner in those decision-making forums, and was now at the top of his agency in his respective state, and said, we're running into a problem. And the problem is that there was a 20 or 30 year kind of overlap of people in the states and the cities and the federal government who all worked together. And so they knew the system, they knew the technical system, they knew the regulatory system. They also knew they had their social bonds. And so they knew how to negotiate and navigate things socially to arrive at, we're going to make this decision about this program this year, and we're all going to be okay with it. And he said, most of them are gone. So now we have really competent people, but people who don't know the technical system, they don't
Yeah.
know the combined regulatory system, and they don't have those social bonds. And so it is taking them much longer, and it is unclear if they can kind of arrive at the same decisions to make the system work that we could for nearly 3 decades. And I thought that was like, one, the fact that he recognized that and was calling me about it was just mind blowing. But also it was something I had never thought of, because I always think, oh yeah, the state agencies do their stuff, or the legislature does their stuff. They'll kind of always figure it out. And then you realize it really comes down to those relationships and trust that are the lubricant that makes it work, or doesn't make it work.
Yeah.
And that handoff, if we had known that was going to be the outcome in, I don't know what it was, 2020, after working on it since 1997, we might have put in, succession plans, or done water university or something, so that next crop, or there could be those people with those relationships and the preparation to step into those roles. And granted, some of them may have been political appointees, but if you had invested in that relational infrastructure, you might not be in that deficit, 30, 20 years later.
Yeah, yeah, it's so critical. I know when we're bringing on account managers, or even folks who are focused on new business, we've said for a long time, business moves at the speed of trust, and so if you don't have that, like, that's ultimately, like you said, you measure all of these things, but at a fundamental level, it's actually a report card of how much are we able to build trust across stakeholders. Things move faster when there's trust, because you don't have to do all of the work but it is hard work to build trust. And you need people committed to you need all stakeholders committed to doing that.
So to kind of put a pin on that, 3 years ago, we did a network analysis of the 2023 UN water meeting, and then World Water Week of that same year. And one of the things that jumped out, it was funny, we were working with a partner, a technical partner that does some of the hardcore network analysis statistics at the time. And he doesn't know the water network, but when he saw the raw output of our data, he said, that's a really fragmented network. And so if you've ever been to any of those national or global meetings, it is very, I'm going to overstate it and say it feels like family, but there is this sense that it is a very tightly knit network, but in reality, it's not. That was one finding. The second finding was there were a small number of people that were the connectors between, the pharmaceutical and the energy sector and the nonprofit, nature people versus the nonprofit water people. There were really thin threads that connected them, and you could almost name all of them. They're obvious, but so that was the second finding. And then especially with the UN meeting, what was really interesting was the evidence that if you invested, so the Netherlands was one of the sponsors of the meeting. The Netherlands also sponsored the New York Water Week, which was happening simultaneously. And you could see that in the network. You could see that they were connecting nodes. The woman who was head of the New York Water Week institution, and the couple individuals from the Netherlands government or representatives were there, some others. And then the other one was, there was Mina Ghouli's Run for the Blue. And Mina showed up, and her connection to other sectors, running communities in Kenya or wherever it may be, showed up. And it was a really strong signal that if you invested in connecting people, and granted, these may have been superficial connections, but if you invested in building them, you could see it in the data. And the example I always use in our trainings and the stuff we facilitate is Gmail. Gmail started off only internal to the Google offices, but there were Google alumni and friends who were at MIT and Harvard, and the folks at Cupertino started to share their links with them. And there's a study out there that shows how what started off as really thin bridges between a few individuals in the Google headquarters and in these research institutions started to multiply, and you got to a point where they were really wide bridges with lots of connections that came out organically. And then it was something that Google probably knew and was probably part of the roadmap you couldn't contain, and so you needed to release it more broadly. But those bridges can be built, and they're really fundamental to creating, whether it's momentum to disseminate something or the strength of resilience of an idea or movement. And ultimately, it's individuals, so that trust of who do I connect with here to find out something or to say something or to make something happen.
Yeah. I mean, I feel like that lands us perfectly into what happens at Catalyst in that Chelsea and Rogue Water and Greg have really created was, how do you build those connections? And I've really appreciated how much they've been intentional about being intentional about creating the space, but also being intentional about leaving enough freedom within that framework for those connections to happen. One of the things we're not allowed to do that Chelsea and I talked about on this podcast was she likes for things to be surprises at Catalyst. So she's like, I don't want to give everything away on any interview. If they want more, you're going to have to sign up and check out the conference, which will be in the show notes to sign up, and any of the guests that are listening would get to know more, get to experience what you're going to bring as a guide to Catalyst. And I could easily, this conversation could go on for another hour. And I'm excited that this has been the conduit to connect us, George. And thank you so much for being on this podcast. And I'm looking forward to meeting you in person at Catalyst in San Diego.
Yep, absolutely. No, this is really fun. And I like that you and the Rogue Water Lab crew kind of term it as guide, because that's the framing that we always use with our clients and our partners, that we don't have the answer. We're not telling you what to do or how to connect the system or wire it, but we'll be a guide to show you where the first steps are and to help you kind of along the way. And so I think it's a really great description of kind of the way Sarah and I see ourselves. I definitely see myself that way.
Yeah. It honors the humanity of the folks that you get to work with, where we're at our best when we get to discover things rather than be told things. And so it is a process of discovery. And so, I'm thrilled and excited that we get to have this conversation. And thank you to everyone who is tuned in to the Make Water Work podcast. We love making this podcast. We also really like that there's been this opportunity to have this Make Water Work Catalyst collab, as the kids say. But we'll see you next time, and can't wait to introduce you to our next guest.